Well, it's a couple of minutes after, so we'll go ahead and get started. I know we've got some out of town this morning, but we're liable to have some visitors show up today too, although you don't really know in these times how things are going to look. I do remember last year on Easter Sunday, we were still meeting remotely. It was all the recorded thing up here, so at least we're a good step above that. And maybe, hopefully, this time next year, we'll have all the tape off the pews and all the masks off, and we'll be totally back to normal. Yeah, they're going to church for the once or twice a year that they could. That's probably it. Today is Easter, as we all know, and this is that Sunday of the year when so many religious groups are celebrating the resurrection of Jesus. And that also means that at this time of year, we might encounter an article or two expressing incredulity at that people could actually, literally believe that Jesus of Nazareth died and then rose up out of the grave. That sort of unsophisticated belief might have been acceptable 2,000 years ago, but come on, you people don't really believe that, do you? Are you that naive? You're just pretending to believe it? We're modern. We're enlightened. We can't actually believe in that sort of nonsense. Just to give you one relatively recent example, because we find these things published out here. This is an article from a fellow named Jay Perini, who's the author of a book, Jesus, the Human Face of God. And this is an article published on CNN.com, an editorial just a couple of years ago. This is one quote from it towards the beginning. Many Christians imagine some literal wakening from the dead and refuse to accept the slightest hint that the resurrection might be regarded as symbolic without denigrating it. And he goes on then to argue that Jesus' resurrection should be interpreted metaphorically, that it's about spiritual and moral rebirth. He says that it's not a resuscitation like Lazarus getting up out of the grave and going and walking on down the street. And he's actually right about that last part. It's not a resuscitation like Lazarus, but he misses the point of how strange Jesus' resurrection is, even within the world of Scripture. The Old Testament and the New Testament give us several examples of people who are resuscitated. Elijah and Elisha did it. We know Jesus did it with Lazarus and with Jairus' daughter. Paul does it with Eutychus. Peter does it with Dorcas. But those people didn't go on to die. They're not all still walking around today. Whereas Jesus was raised to a life in continuity with what was before. Yeah, the tomb was empty, the body is recognizable, and yet it's also somehow strangely different, where he appears and disappears, and he suddenly shows up in locked rooms, and people sometimes recognize him and sometimes don't. The point is, Lazarus and those other examples, those aren't resurrections. He's on the right track, but he misses the point of how unusual Jesus' resurrection is, and how ancient Jews believed that things like those resuscitations could happen, and yet they still remark about how strange Jesus' resurrection is. So all that's to say, the way that the New Testament talks about Jesus' resurrection from the dead won't let us off the hook with metaphor. It just doesn't fit in with the way that they speak about it. They treat the bodily resurrection as fact. And that brings up the question we want to talk about today. Can we really believe that? Can we believe that Jesus was raised from the dead as a historical fact? Now, This is one of those questions. Nobody asked me this question. Okay, this is my question because of the day. And I take it for granted that everybody in here does believe in it as a fact. If you don't, we can talk about it at some point if you want to. But I take it for granted everybody here does believe it. The reason we want to look at this question today is to give us some grounding for that, to confirm that, or especially when you run across those articles like that one I quoted from, or maybe if you have friends or relatives who question you about this. How can you really believe that? That's why we want to look at this question together this morning. And I want us to talk about, sort of by way of introduction, the historical context so that there's not any confusion here. We all know that when people die, their bodies, they're dead. They don't just begin to live again. We're all aware of that. And sometimes, as I've sort of already implied, sometimes people will imply as if ancient people were somehow stupid and they didn't know that. Oh, they must have thought that there were resurrections happening all the time. Well, no, they knew that too. And in fact, this concept of resurrection of Jesus is a departure from both Jewish and pagan expectations for how death and life after death worked. For most pagans, we're speaking in generalities here, but for most pagans, most people in the Greek and Roman world, there was a belief that life continued, existence continued in some sense after death. But it's not anything like the Christian hope. So, for instance, in Homer is basically like the Old Testament for pagans. There are these shades down in Hades, in the underworld, but they're shadowy reflections, and they desperately want bodies again. They want to be embodied. They're missing that old life, but they're never going to have it. They're just sort of pale imitations of what they were during their earthly lives. For Plato, if you were to look at his ideas, which were influential on a lot of people, even in the first century, and of course even today, in a lot of ways, we just don't realize it. But for Plato, you were disembodied, but that was actually better. An existence as pure spirit was superior to being in a body. That body was just holding you back. But you see, in either case, and those are the two dominant views, in either case, whether you're longing for a body or whether you're better off without one, you don't have a body. It's a pure disembodied existence, always. Resurrection was not a word that was used by pagans at all, because it just didn't happen. It was completely foreign to the way that they thought about death. Now, they believed in life after death. They believed in visions and spirits and ghosts and things like that. The one thing they didn't believe in was resurrection, because that word resurrection, by definition, means a new body. And they didn't believe that that was possible. For Jews, there was a diversity of beliefs in the first century. Some basically agreed with that pagan view of Hades, that it's just disembodied and you can't ever have a new body and you're longing for one. Sheol. The Sadducees essentially had that belief. You remember that they don't believe in not only resurrection, but they didn't believe in angels or spirits or anything like that. Others, Jewish thinkers, believed in that sort of disembodied existence of pure spirit that was a good thing, the way that Plato did. The first century Jewish writer Philo, if you've heard of him, he falls into that category as one really good example. But there were a lot of people in the first century, your average Jew on the street, who did believe in a bodily resurrection, that God would raise bodies from the dead. You'd live on in an embodied state, but they believed that would only happen at the end. that God would look after the soul in some way until at the very last day there would be a judgment, and he would raise all the bodies out of the ground, and then he would judge the world, new embodied existence. Martha is a good example of that in John chapter 11. Actually, I'll look at this real quick. If you remember this is Martha, the sister of Lazarus. Lazarus has died, of course, and Jesus comes and he's consoling them, and Martha says to Jesus in verse 21, "Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he'll rise again in the resurrection on the last day." That's a good example. She believed that on the last day, yes, he would rise again. But what I'm suggesting here with all this background is this is why the resurrection of Jesus was so surprising to everyone. Pagans obviously were shocked by the concept. Remember Paul on Mars Hill? We're going to start our sermon this morning there, but that's in Acts chapter 17. Do you remember that Paul starts preaching to them about the unknown God, and he says, "I want to tell you about this God," and then he says God is going to judge everyone, and he's demonstrated that by raising this one man from the dead. He's talking about Jesus. And do you remember their response when he talked about the resurrection from the dead? They laughed at him. They mocked him because that was resurrection. That's ludicrous. Those sophisticated Athenians didn't believe in anything like that. But even though it fits somewhat on this Jewish map of thought, it still breaks the bonds of it in a lot of important ways. For one thing, for Jews, the idea of resurrection is peripheral. They believe in it, but it's not really that important in the first century. But for Christians, it is at the center of their thought. We're going to talk about that in our sermon this morning too. That's really going to be the thrust of it. But if you see in the preaching in Acts, if you look at the letters, if you look at what they staked their lives upon, Jesus' resurrection was central to the identity of the church. Secondly, in Judaism, resurrection is a one-time, end-of-the-world event. No one before Jesus expected one man to be raised right in the middle of history, before the end, as a sort of foretaste, a promise, a guarantee of what God was going to do. But Jesus' resurrection, Christians believed and taught that this was an anticipation of what God was going to do for everybody who was part of his people. The whole point in that background is we can't just attribute this belief to a sort of unsophisticated first century superstition as if this was common, as if people thought, oh yeah, people are raised from the dead all the time. Well, no, they didn't believe that at all. This was a radical departure from any pagan worldview, and it was even a departure from Jewish expectation of what God would do. And that in itself, thinking about the fact that the disciples weren't looking for this, that they had no concept of this, that in itself suggests that something, at least, happened to change their minds, to change their worldview that we need to account for. And so the question is, what happened? We could talk about this in a lot more detail, but for time's sake, I just want to suggest two pieces of evidence this morning, two big pieces. We're going to talk about some subpoints under each one, but first of all, there is the evidence of the empty tomb, and then secondly, there is the eyewitness testimony of those who claimed to see Jesus after he was raised. And when we put both of those things together, we have a powerful case, I think. But first of all, this evidence of the empty tomb, if you have your Bible, you might want to flip it over to Matthew chapter 27. Now, all four gospel accounts record that the tomb that Jesus was buried in after his crucifixion was found empty on Sunday morning. We know that. But I want to look at Matthew's account in particular, because Matthew goes so far as to include details about how that tomb was guarded in the interim that the other accounts don't have. Matthew 27, verse 57, when it was evening, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who was also a disciple of Jesus. He went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate ordered it to be given to him. And Joseph took the body and wrapped it in a clean linen shroud and laid it in his own tomb, which he had cut in the rock. And he rolled a great stone to the entrance of the tomb and went away. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were there, sitting opposite the tomb. The next day, that is, after the day of preparation, the chief priest and the Pharisees gathered before Pilate and said, "Sir, we remember how that impostor said while he was still alive, 'After 3 days I will rise.' Therefore, order the tomb to be made secure until the third day, lest his disciples go and steal him away and tell the people he's risen from the dead." Sorry, I lost my place. There we go. "And the last fraud will be worse than the first." Pilate said to them, "You have a guard of soldiers. Go make it as secure as you can." So they went and made the tomb secure by sealing the stone and setting a guard. Those details about making this tomb as secure as possible here are all worth noting. For one thing, there is that great stone, first of all, before they even did anything themselves. There's that great stone rolled in front of the tomb. This was a common practice on most Jewish tombs buried after the custom Jesus was during this day, because that stone was designed to protect from anyone outside who wanted to get in, whether it was a human being or whether it was beasts that might try to come in and devour the bodies. But these stones were typically so large that they would require several men to move them. They were enormous. They weighed hundreds of pounds. There's a reason, if you were to flip over to Mark's account in chapter 16, and verse number 3, that the women are on their way to the tomb there, and they're saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb?" There's a reason the women are worried about that. They're going to continue to anoint the body of Jesus with spices, but they're worried that they're not going to be able to get in. Now, this is several women there together, 3 women in Mark's account. It's so heavy that their combined efforts, they weren't going to be able to move the stone. That right there is one thing to keep in mind. Furthermore, back to Matthew, there is a seal placed over the stone. This was likely a cord, a rope, something like that was passed across the stone there on the outside, and then it was fixed there on the ends with clay, with sealing clay. And that clay was impressed with a seal that indicated the authority of the Roman Empire. And the whole point of this was legal authentication. Anybody who moved the stone would obviously break the seal. Can't move the stone without breaking the seal. And in doing so, sealed there with the Roman stamp of approval, you are incurring the wrath of Roman law. This is a warning to anyone not to break that seal. It almost certainly would have been sealed in the presence of those guards there over the tomb. The guard, to give the gist of it, the guard was there to prevent anybody from rolling away the stone and stealing the body. The seal was there to prevent the guard from colluding with them in some way. This is really a threat to the guards more than anyone else, that they don't want to run afoul of Roman law. And we come then to the guard. Pilate says, "You have a guard," and there's been some question, is he talking here about the temple guard? You have your own guard, you can do it, or is he giving a guard into their hands, giving them Roman soldiers? And without getting too far into the weeds on that, I think most likely he's referring to Roman soldiers here. He's giving them a detachment to help guard it here. It's probably a watch. A standard Roman watch consisted of 4 soldiers. One would be actively guarding it while the other 3 would be there nearby, resting, waiting to take their turn, but close enough that if there was some sort of problem, he could call for them quickly, not only within earshot, but probably they had their eyes on him if they weren't asleep. We're all aware of the discipline of Roman soldiers, how highly they valued duty, and how severely the Romans kept their troops in line. If they would have failed in their duty, they wouldn't have just, they wouldn't have had kitchen duty or lost their weekend leave or anything like that. They wouldn't have even busted in rank. They would have probably been killed. For most offenses, most dereliction of duty in the Roman army, there was capital punishment. So this is serious. If they would have failed, they probably would have been killed. All of this adds up to just how extensive these security measures were that they took. And that's on top of the standard preparations for burial. We read here Jesus was wrapped in linen. We know he had spices that were used there. Jesus was buried according to a particular Jewish tradition. We know about this from other accounts outside of Scripture, contemporary accounts, that basically had two steps. First, the body would be wrapped tightly with linen, all the way from the ankles up to the shoulders. These strips would have been about a foot wide and wrapped tightly around them over the whole body. And it would be perfumed with spices. A lot of these spices were mixed up so that they were like pastes, so that they would not only perfume the body, but also they would serve as a sort of glue to hold those wrappings together, fixing it all up tight. Pounds and pounds of spices after the body had been washed and straightened, wrapped here. It would then be placed on a shelf in these tombs to decay. A lot of times, this is a new tomb, as Scripture tells us, but a lot of times these tombs would hold more than one body. They'd be placed there to decay. That's part of the reason for the spices, because of the smell. And then once they decayed, the bones would be gathered up and they'd be placed into an ossuary, a bone box, and that's the way they'd be stored permanently. Given all of that, those general preparations and the specific security measures taken for Jesus, how do we then account for an empty tomb? A number of explanations have been proposed for that, from the ridiculous to actually the plausible. And I'm not going to go into every possibility, but just a couple of the ones that are most frequently mentioned. Some have tried to argue that he never actually died, that he only appeared to. This was the favorite argument of rationalists during the Enlightenment. It's also a popular argument for some Muslims today. But the argument runs that Jesus just swooned. Some people put it. Sometimes they'll say that maybe he was given a drug there on the cross that made him appear to die. But in any case, they put him there in the tomb, and there in the cool of the tomb he revived, got up, moved the stone, and walked out under his own power. There's obviously a lot of problems with that. First of all, Roman soldiers knew how to kill people. They were good at that. They crucified people regularly. Probably these Romans who crucified Jesus had performed hundreds, maybe even thousands of them before. And we all know the gruesome details, the scourging, the journey carrying the cross, and how he fell under the weight of it, just how horrible it was to be nailed there. So you can imagine how excruciating all of this was. And then John records the detail that he's stabbed in the side so that they can make sure that he's dead. He was dead. But let's assume, for the sake of argument, that he wasn't. All right? Let's stipulate to that. Somehow he survived all of that, and somehow the Romans were completely ignorant of the fact that he survived. Imagine having gone through that dramatic loss of blood, all of those traumatic injuries, in a tomb with no medical attention. How does that revive him, rather than just extinguishing whatever flickering life was within him that made him appear to be dead? How does he get out of those tightly wound grave clothes laden with those pounds and pounds of spices sticking him together? How does he move away a stone on his own that required multiple men to move it into place? How does he do all of that without somehow alerting the guard? And assuming he somehow did all of that, when and how did he die? Because he had to have died at some point after. Well, what happened? Why do we have no account, no parallel, nothing arguing that no, Jesus in fact died here later? It's instructive that literally no one in antiquity made this claim that he only appeared to die, not even Jesus' opponents. They argued that something else happened to the body, but no one argued that he hadn't actually died, because it's just so completely implausible. There are too many obstacles, and it's fascinating to me how this got to be the favorite argument of those 18th century rationalists. There's no question he was dead. The question is what happened to the body. And so some have argued that the women went to the wrong tomb. They were simply mistaken. Now, we read it here in Matthew. The synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all record that some of the women were there and noted where he was buried. We read that. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were there sitting opposite the tomb when he was buried. But somehow, in the matter of just a few hours from before sundown there on Friday to Sunday morning, somehow they forgot. And then somehow, too, Peter and John, when they later ran to the tomb, they ran to the very same wrong tomb also, I suppose. Okay. I would think even if they went to the wrong tomb, they would have pretty quickly discovered their error. But even if they did, if this is true, why didn't Jesus' enemies ever produce his body? All the Sanhedrin would have to do on Pentecost. Peter gets up, Acts chapter 2. His sermon is focused on the fact that you killed Jesus, but God has raised him from the dead. He even talks about the fact that David, the patriarch David, his tomb is with us. He's been long since dead. You can go and visit his tomb. But God's raised Jesus. All they would have had to do is say, well, actually, you can go visit Jesus' tomb. It's right here. Here's the body, in fact. And that would have been that. Why did that never happen? And that's all down through the years, not just on Pentecost. Sooner or later, we talked about that two-step burial process. Sooner or later, Jesus' body would have decayed. Someone would have taken those bones, they would have put them in a bone box. Just take out the bones and prove that they're wrong. And then there's the matter of, okay, they went to the wrong tomb. For whatever reason, the body was never produced. But where then is Jesus' tomb? We have multiple records from ancient times of these tombs, where these ossuaries were, of holy men among the Jews being revered, of martyrs or those who were viewed as prophets. People treated them like shrines. They went to them and they made pilgrimages to them. There's no evidence of that ever happening with any place attributed to being Jesus' tomb. Why not? It doesn't fit. So the most plausible alternative suggestion, that he didn't die or they went to the wrong tomb, those are ridiculous. The most plausible alternative suggestion is theft of the body. There's a reason that his enemies even preemptively seized on that there. And in fact, later on, if you were to go down into Matthew chapter 28, they pay the soldiers and say, tell people his disciples came by night and stole him while you were asleep. And if this comes to the governor's ears, we'll satisfy him and we'll keep you out of trouble. So they do that, and that's why that rumor got started, Matthew says. Grave robbery was well known in ancient times. This is the theory that the Jewish leaders tried to spread. This is plausible in the sense that it at least takes the empty tomb seriously. It's not that he only appeared to die. It's not that they went to the wrong tomb. No, the tomb he was placed in really was found empty. Now, it does admittedly run into some issues with those security measures. How did they steal the body without those soldiers knowing it? Not only that, the real piece of evidence that makes this hard to explain is the folded grave clothes. A grave robber wouldn't have taken time to remove those clothes and fold them up neatly there. They would have just taken the body and ran for it. But all that's to say, the empty tomb by itself doesn't necessarily prove anything. You could argue that the body was stolen the way that Jesus' enemies tried to do. But this testimony of the empty tomb becomes more powerful when we combine it with the testimony of the eyewitnesses. Our primary sources for Jesus' resurrection are, of course, the gospel accounts. Critical scholars reject these as reliable for a variety of reasons when it comes to the resurrection in particular. One is their so-called late date. That is, even on the most conservative estimate, the Gospel of Mark, usually thought to be the earliest one, was probably not written until at least the 50s. Some would place it even in the 60s, the 70s. John's Gospel might not have been written till close to the end of the first century. So all of these are from anywhere to 30 to even as much as 70 years after the fact. Now, I'd point out, for one thing, that that's not really that long a time span by either ancient or even modern standards. I mean, would you consider someone's firsthand account of the Vietnam War to be unreliable just because they wrote it down today? Well, no. And that's the type of time span that we're talking about. But another argument that scholars will sometimes make, critical, skeptical scholars, is that these documents are originally anonymous. That is, by tradition, they're written by eyewitnesses in the case of Matthew and John, in the case of Mark and Luke by those who perhaps weren't eyewitnesses but who were associates of apostles. But how do we really know? How do we know that they had access to reliable information and they're not just passing on stories that were made up decades after the fact? Okay, let's stipulate to that again for the sake of argument and look at the claims Paul makes. 1 Corinthians chapter 15. We won't read through all of this, but this is, of course, the chapter where Paul deals with the resurrection more extensively than anywhere else in Scripture. Paul says in verse number 4, talking about Christ, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Of course, then Paul says, last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared to me. Paul doesn't only make the claim that Jesus was raised. He says, if you're skeptical, if you doubt this, he can produce 500 eyewitnesses 20 years later who saw him there. You can go and ask them for yourself. Some of them had died, but most of them are still alive. Modern science is insistent on empirical evidence for the validity of a hypothesis. Well, this is just the kind of evidence that's presented here for Jesus' resurrection. The sort of thing that you can see with your eyes, hear with your ears, touch with your hands. We have empirical evidence in the form of this testimony. And unlike those gospel accounts, we're certain about the author of this and we're certain about the date. Paul notes in this chapter, he taught the resurrection personally in Corinth. We know for a fact Paul was in Corinth about the year 50. We know that from Acts chapter 18 because Gallio was the proconsul, and that's when we know historically he was proconsul of Greece. So in other words, we're already to within 20 years of the resurrection there. But where did Paul hear about the resurrection in the first place? Back in verse 3, we didn't read this, but he says, I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received. That indicates that we have a tradition that was handed down to Paul that he then handed on to them in Corinth. Where did he get that? We have a probable answer from Galatians chapter 1, and I won't read this for time's sake. But in Galatians 1, 3 years after his conversion, Paul goes to Jerusalem where he conferred with Peter for 15 days. That's verse 18. The only other church leader he saw at that time was James, verse number 19. What do you think they were talking about at that time other than the gospel that Paul preached, what he's talking about here in 1 Corinthians? Do you think it's a coincidence that the only two individuals he mentions by name here in 1 Corinthians 15, Peter and James, are the same two, the only two that he conferred with when he went down to Jerusalem and mentions that in Galatians? I suggest putting that together, the most likely answer is that Paul received this tradition from Peter and from James 3 years after his conversion, that they told him firsthand what they'd seen and what they'd heard. So at that point, we're already to within about a half dozen years after Jesus' death. And of course, we can note finally that this material Paul received goes back earlier still, because Peter and James were those eyewitnesses. It came directly from men who claimed to have seen the risen Lord. The point here is that this content, Paul's teaching about the resurrection, goes back to the very beginning. It's not something that was invented later on. So what this really comes down to is whether or not we find those witnesses, those eyewitnesses who claimed this from the beginning, whether or not we find them to be reliable. Now, the skeptic says that, well, we can't really trust them because their accounts are biased. They believed in Jesus. I've talked about this before, but my response to that is all history, all journalism is biased. We can't stand on any sort of neutral, objective ground, even if we try to. It's good to try to be as objective as you can, but we all have our own preconceptions, our own presuppositions we bring to any task like this. Those critics are just as biased in their own way. They just think that they're not. Consider, here's a sort of by the way point. In the gospel accounts, who are the first witnesses, the principal witnesses? Who sees Jesus first after his resurrection? The women. That's right. It's something that's foreign to our world, but women were not regarded as credible in the ancient world. If you were just inventing this whole cloth, you would not have had him appear to women first. And in fact, maybe that's why Paul doesn't even mention them in 1 Corinthians 15, because he's trying to build the credibility of his case there. I'm not certain. But the point is, nobody would have made that up. So that right there has the ring of truth. But they argue then that, well, Jesus only appeared to people who believed in him. But that's not true either. Thomas is a good example. Thomas clearly didn't believe. He was reluctant to. Paul certainly didn't, even though the appearances to him are later and of a different category. But more to the point, and here's why I went into that background at the beginning. None of Jesus' followers believed after his death and before his resurrection that he was the Messiah. Not a one of them believed that anymore. You go back to Luke chapter 24, and we have a good example of it there. In Luke chapter 24, we have this encounter on the road to Emmaus, and it's very telling. These two men walking there, you remember Jesus suddenly appears amongst them, and he asks them, what are you talking about? And Cleopas says, you been living under a rock, man? Are you the only guy in Jerusalem that doesn't know what's happened? He says, concerning Jesus of Nazareth, a man who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and rulers delivered him up to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. We'd hoped it, but obviously we were wrong. There were a lot of would-be messiahs floating around in the centuries around Jesus' life, all the way from the time of the Maccabees up to the time of Bar Kokhba's revolt in the 2nd century A.D. in particular. Basically, all of them got killed by the government because of their messianic pretensions. And do you know what happened to their movements when these men died? The movements died too, because it was evident that they were mistaken, that they weren't the Messiah, because the Messiah wasn't going to die. Nobody expected that. So too for Jesus' disciples. We all know what happened. After his death, they were completely dejected. They were terrified. They didn't have any hope of a resurrection. Remember, there was no expectation for that. They were ready to go back fishing in Peter's case. They were all hiding out there in that room, terrified that they were going to be next. But in just a few weeks, these same men were overflowing with courage, ready to die for Christ. Why? What happened? Well, their explanation was that they had seen the risen Lord. And here is where those psychological and revisionist explanations fall apart. You know, nowadays, people will try to explain this as cognitive dissonance, that they just wanted him to be alive so badly they believed it. But remember, there's no expectation that he'd be alive, or that this was a mass hallucination. They had some sort of visionary experience. Well, first century Jews believed things like that could happen, but they had words for it. It was his spirit. It was his ghost. Acts chapter 12, that's what they think when Peter comes knocking on the door at first. They wouldn't have said he's been raised from the dead. Or you go back to that article I quoted from, that they had some sort of rich spiritual experience, that Jesus was somehow alive metaphorically. They experienced God's grace in a new way, or they felt his forgiveness, or whatever. That sounds more like Plato than it does Jewish hope, than it does the Jewish concept of immortality that Jesus lived on metaphorically in some sense. And it's not resurrection. Resurrection is a body raised again to life. You see, my point is, we come back around here again to the empty tomb. Either one of these two things in isolation, these two pieces of evidence independently, we could explain them. The empty tomb, yeah, maybe the body was stolen. These purported eyewitness sightings, well, maybe they just hallucinated them. Maybe it's spiritual, maybe it's metaphor. But when we put these two pieces of evidence together, that's when it becomes so powerful. Either one without the other might offer alternative, plausible explanations, but the empty tomb points to the fact that Jesus was alive again, and the appearances point to the fact that it was this same Jesus who had died, that they were seeing him, they knew him, they recognized him. Both of these combined explain the faith of the early church and why they were willing to die for this. Now, the bell rang, we're out of time. I want to offer one note of caution as we close, the usual thing I'll offer when we go into these historical cases. Does this prove that Jesus was raised from the dead? Well, no, not in the sense of mathematical proof, but that's not how history works. What it does show is that these stories about Jesus being raised weren't just later legends that were somehow invented, somehow tacked on decades, centuries after his death. His earliest followers clearly not only believed that he had died, but something happened that made them think he had been raised from the dead, and that this was no metaphor because the tomb really was empty. So the question we have to ask then is, what happened? The empty tomb, the eyewitness appearances, those are well attested. Those are historical facts. And when we ask that question, what does that add up to? Any other historical inquiry, you'd say, well, it points to the fact that it really happened. If our only response to that is, well, yes, the tomb was empty, yes, they really did believe that they saw him alive again, but our only counter to that is, well, we know that can't be the case because that's impossible. I'd respond, yeah, precisely. That's the point. It's the question of what you find credible or not. Questions or comments? I know we ran 2 or 3 minutes over there. Yeah, Jerry. Right. If you didn't hear that, Jerry says, who would die for something they knew to be a lie? That points to the fact that they obviously didn't steal the body. They believe this. Now, you go back to that psychological explanation. Is it possible that they just genuinely believed it and were mistaken? Sure. But then, how do you explain the empty tomb? That's why those two things go together. But that's a great point, Jerry. Thanks for your attention this morning. Luke 24.